they were able to single out that particular location as having the highest potential. The one thing I want to bring up is this aquifer system has been studied by the USGS and the state of New Hampshire for several decades. There's some really good mapping here. And it's a pretty productive aquifer that extends up that whole north branch of the Sugar River Valley.
Frank,
yes.
Since the labels are so small, would it be helpful if I pointed out some of these things?
Thank you.
They're pretty small. It's hard to see if you're not familiar. This is the well site. Each one of these blue labels here is a test site that was done previously, and through evaluation of all these sites, this site was determined to be the most promising of the test sites. And this is Croydon Corbin Road right here, Route 10. So we kind of get an idea of that.
And so, in saying what's the best site, what does that mean? It means we have very thick aquifer material, we have very coarse aquifer material, it's permeable, it can transmit, it can store a lot of groundwater, and so based on that, those particular features, we zone in on that particular area there.
And just to add, this yellow area here is the land that's owned or controlled by the town of Newport, which provides us with this protective radius, this green circle, is statutory required protective zone around the well.
We'll talk about a couple of different distances, but as Hunter was just indicating, what we're talking about is the sanitary protection radius. That's land that the town has to own and control to protect the water quality for the well. And then there are several other protective distances based around that well, looking at things such as water quality influences that could occur from other adjoining lands or influences on other adjoining lands if the well is pumped. And we'll get to that.
And one last thing, the town's existing water system terminates right, don't hold me to this, I'm going to be within 50 yards, right about here. So you can see the connection from a potential future site, a well station. It's called a water. Sorry?
The airport? Where's the airport?
Well, the airport runway is right here. Yep. And there's a grassy runway over here. This is the paved runway over here.
Right. Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry. The two.
So
where the existing well, or where the proposed well is?
This red dot right there.
And then you pointed out another spot, about 150 yards.
I'm sorry?
You pointed out
yes. The town's existing water main terminates somewhere in this vicinity right here. So there's your question. It's a short run to connect with the main.
Okay.
Right.
Question. Of course, the well draw is east of, or west of the Route 10. Well, what's on the west side? Is that also controlled by the city?
This side over here?
Yeah.
No, that's private.
Private property.
Just to clarify, the previous slide says that the proposed well site is east of Route 10, but it's obviously west.
It's west of Route 10.
Yes, yeah, it says east of. That's fine. Yeah, I kept going.
I'm sorry if it says that.
Sorry, where the proposed well site is that owned by the town or is that the Heartwood Park?
The town owns Hazlitt Park too. The town owns all this property here and everything within this yellow line here. So the town owns land beyond the protected radius. Hazlitt Park.
I thought that was the park that was supposed to be for the tail gun from the war, and it was just supposed to be for Memorial Park.
Yes, that's correct. And that's compatible with the protective zone. You know, in the protective zone, and these guys can speak to this more eloquently than I can, but in the protective zone, you're looking for no development, no industry, nothing that would contribute to the potential contamination of the water. So parks are passive. There's no industrial activity going on there. There's no use of chemicals or things of that nature. But Hazlitt Park is this piece down here that you're referring to.
I was under the impression that was the proposed site for a dog park at one point. Is that still the case?
No, dog park is proposed for John Stark Highway in downtown.
Okay, so just to give you an idea, we talk about aquifers. One thing about groundwater is nobody really sees it because it's below ground. But I thought this would be useful to give you an idea of if you could dig into the aquifer and take a look at what the material is like. That's what we're looking at right here. This is called stratified crypts. So these sand and gravel deposits were actually laid down by the glaciers in the area that left about 12,000, 14,000 years ago. And you can see there's some layering, you can see there's bands of coarser material, bands of finer material. So that whole intent of doing the exploration work is to look for areas where this material is the thickest and where there's mostly coarse material. And then based on that, that's what we focus in on putting in your actual well. Yes.
So an aquifer, excuse me, isn't like a big lake that's underground, this stuff?
Think about that being underneath the Sugar River, and think about groundwater always moving through it. It's not a bathtub. Groundwater is always moving. It's moving from areas of higher elevation, or what we call recharge areas, to discharge areas. And discharge areas are swamps, wetlands, streams. You notice the Sugar River, even in really dry periods, there's water moving through. That's groundwater naturally seeping, coming from areas further north and coming back in. So it's always moving. This obviously isn't saturated. I just want to show you what the material would look like just underground and having water in it. All right, to give you an idea, so all this exploration work that was done, in essence, what happens is we're able to figure out what that material looks like and the distribution of it. You have what are called cross sections. One cross section is kind of in a east-west, roughly parallel to Corbin Bridge Road. The other one is kind of up the Sugar Valley, and it gives you an idea. The orange material is the material that's being targeted, because that's the coarse material for the test well. And so it's actually based on, this is a case where the preliminary report is utilizing very much site-specific information. So it's not like we hope it's there, we know it's there. And the one thing to keep in mind, or I want to bring up, is the aquifer is relatively thick in certain areas. Where the well is going to, Hunter, could you do me a favor? I think it says proposed well there, that one line. Right. So the aquifer thickness there is like over 100 feet. So which is pretty thick for that kind of aquifer in this part of the country. So that's important, and that's the other reason why we focus on that area, to be able to get the highest potential for the yield and the capability of the well to meet the demands. Okay, so the next step, as Drew had mentioned, is that we have put together a plan, a proposed plan, and the well still has to be drilled, a large diameter. Reason is because those wells that were used to identify this location are only 2.5 inches in diameter. You can't pump more than about 60 gallons a minute out of it. We're talking upwards of 400 gallons a minute. So you actually need to have a much larger diameter well so you can get a larger pump in. So the next step would be to put that large diameter well, which if it proves out and is permitted, would wind up being the north well that the town would be relying on for its supply. So the well would get installed in that same location where I showed you earlier where the site would be. As part of that construction of that well, material will be collected as the well is advanced down through the aquifer. The material that will be brought up to the surface will be used to pretty much check what's already been found in those small diameter wells. And based on that, the well will be designed, it'll have a screen. Okay, that's how these wells work. They're not rock wells. So they don't rely on fractures in the bedrock to move the water to the well, which is what a lot of domestic wells are in the area, which are smaller diameter. This well actually relies on a piece, best way to describe it, is a piece of casing that has a bunch of slot, that the openings and how many are designed to let the water move from the aquifer into the well in the most efficient manner. Once it's drilled, the pump can go in, the well is cleaned up, it's what they call developed, so that the efficiency is at its highest, and then the well is ready to be tested. Okay, let's assume the well has gone in, we're at that point. So what's going to happen is the well will be pumped at 400 gallons per minute for 7 days. Prior to that, for about 7 days, Water level measurements are going to be collected at a bunch of different locations, and I'll describe that shortly. And after the 7 days of pumping, water levels will continue to be measured for another 7 days. So the whole point of this is to determine what the impact on the aquifer is from the proposed 400 gallons per minute. And what we mean by that, what's the impact? Well, can the aquifer near the well replace the water that's being pulled out of it? Is there enough recharge? How far out into the aquifer do we actually influence water levels? That's why we talk about things like potential impact areas. We want to know, will it affect anybody's wells that are nearby? Will it affect nearby wetlands? Will it affect nearby Sugar River? So all of that is kind of built into this test. We look to establish 7 days of nothing, background conditions, 7 days of pumping, which is the stress, and then 7 days of what's called recovery to see if the aquifer recovers back and returns to where it was before we did the test. Monitor wells. So we'll have observation wells. As Hunter had showed you on that map earlier, there's still a bunch of these 2.5-inch exploration wells that are out there. We're going to use those to measure the water levels in the aquifer in response to this well pumping. And based on how far they are and if they respond or not, it gives us an idea of how far out into the aquifer the pumping will influence. Wetlands. A lot of wetlands can basically be a function of groundwater discharge. It can also be a function of the capture of surface water that actually recharges the aquifers. So we have very shallow wells and points that go in those, and we measure the water levels in those over time. And then we'll also be looking at the stream itself. We have numerous locations along the stretch of Sugar River where we'll be looking at the water level, looking at water level in the sediment below the river to see if there's any kind of a change in exchange. We look at temperature. Groundwater temperature actually can tell us something also about that influence. So there's a lot of data that gets collected. It's a pretty vigorous testing program, and that's why when the test is done, it takes usually upwards of weeks to maybe even a month or two to go through all the analysis to basically establish these conditions. We're going to collect water samples several times during the course of the test. As Drew had mentioned, one of the things that we have to look at is naturally occurring constituents in the groundwater. Do they affect the well's performance? Do they affect the quality of the water that's going to come out of the tap? And then, of course, there are man-made contaminants. We check for those, too, to see if there's any kind of influence. This particular site is located in an area that, is pretty much surrounded by undeveloped land. We don't have a paper mill next door. We don't have a gas station nearby. It's primarily residential, farms, and we have the small little airport that's to the south. Groundwater quality has actually been preliminarily established when they did the exploration work. So they actually did look for some of these man-made contaminants and so forth, and based on that testing, the groundwater quality meets all of the current standards DES has for drinking water. So if we had seen something that was a red flag, probably wouldn't be going in this area. We haven't seen that at this point. So we've kind of gone through that measure too. Yes?
What's the diameter of the well you're drilling? How deep are you going?
It's going to be a 18-inch diameter. It'll probably be down about 100, 107, 108 feet. And then once all this is done, as I said, we actually go through the data and we look at a bunch of things that we have to answer in response to the DES's concerns. To give you an idea of kind of what's taking place, so this is kind of the sequence. The photo up in the upper left shows you a well that's being pumped. So you can see there's a casing, there's a pump that's down in the well, it's hooked up to a discharge pipe. There's a valve at the top that regulates the flow rate, and then the water continues on and it goes through a discharge pipe where it's discharged out to a particular location. At the well itself, there are measurements made for water levels so that wellhead, we call the top of the well, is modified to afford that. This test will use a lot of manual measurements, but also automatic data collection devices. That's a DES requirement, but it also gives high resolution Drew showed you that photo earlier where you could pick up people actually using their well during the test. Well, the only way you pick that up is with these devices. Because if you're not sampling and collecting the measurements at a pretty significant frequency, you could miss those occurrences. All right, so that's going to be incorporated. The water comes out at the end, and here you can see there are some hay bales, there's some erosion control measurements that are being taken care of. The same will take place for this test. There's a device at the end of the discharge pipe that allows us to accurately measure the water flow rate, okay? We said 400 GPM. That gets continuously recorded and logged so we know whether or not there have been any variations, so that if we say the well is good for 400 GPM, it's based on that well pumping at 400 GPM. It's not based on it pumping at 350 or 500 GPM. And then finally, typical observation wells, you can see they're basically steel casings. Usually what they are is they're converted exploration wells that have caps on them, and they'll have devices in it that are continuously measuring water levels. So one of the things that has to be proposed, projected, as far as part of doing this preliminary report is what we're going to call, there's the wellhead protection area, there's the recharge area, there's what's called the projected impact area. And so one of the reasons that you're here is because absent any of this larger scale aquifer testing, we have to kind of make a projection or an estimate of what parts of the aquifer might be impacted when we're doing the test or when the well is actually in place. And so the map on the left kind of shows you there's a red dotted area. And that is what has been identified as the PIA, or the projected impact area. So what that suggests is that any portions of the aquifer within that area might be influenced when that well is pumped. Again, we don't know because we haven't pumped it yet. Okay, but the test is only for 7 days. Okay, the test is not going to go right into the well being connected to the system. All right, so we have, as Hunter had pointed out earlier, we've got a bunch of these observation wells that are up the valley. They will be used as part of the monitoring, as well as several private wells that have been identified. And we actually have a well that's going to be outside of this area. It's called the ambient well. It's a well because of its location is anticipated not to be influenced at all. And that's going to be used for comparison purposes. It's kind of our benchmark or our baseline. So it gives you an idea.
Are some of those private wells that you're going to be testing from in Croydon?
Yeah, they are. So what you'll see here is, now again, it really depends on the aquifer. We're in a sand and gravel aquifer. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the residential wells are in bedrock. It's a different aquifer. Doesn't mean they're not hydraulically connected. The difference is they're lower. So we're not pulling water out of that, we're pulling water from above it. So if it's a well that's in bedrock, generally speaking, unless it's the only one in that particular location, we're probably not going to use it. We're looking for the sand and gravel wells, because those are the ones that reflect what's happening in the aquifer. In our proposal, we actually identify a bunch of, this is the minimum number of monitoring locations. So there are several of these test wells, there are wetland wells, there are private wells that have been identified. And I will tell you right now that in terms of, if they're within that PIA area, you know, those are the wells we're looking at. We're not looking at wells, say, up into the next town, or wells that are up on the ridge sides because they're in bedrock. We really are looking only at the ones that are in the valley or on the edge of the valley. So what will happen as part of the process, the review process, state will take a look at what we're proposing. Now, I will tell you this. Once we get approval for which wells to monitor, we need to have the permission of the owner. And you think that most people want to do that. It's happened in situations where people don't want you touching their well. So you give the option, it's really up to them. Okay. And then finally, what are we looking at? So Drew had showed you those two graphs, but I just want to show you two pieces of information. The graph on the left really focuses on the pumping well, and How the water levels respond in terms of when it's pumping and when it's shut off, give us an idea of what that long-term yield is for the well. If you notice, when the water level drops here, it starts to kind of flatten out. And when it starts to flatten out, that means the well is in balance. That pumping rate is in balance with what the aquifer can produce. Doesn't mean the aquifer can't produce more, it just means at that particular rate. When the water level comes back up, okay, it needs to start to go back to where the static is in a timely fashion. That means the water has been replaced by adequate recharge. So that's an important graph for us. The other one is the one all the way on the right. And this gets back to where you're kind of the focus of your question is. We look at all those observation wells and how do they respond to the pumping. You can fit a line to that, and it gives us an idea of what's called the radius of influence. And that radius of influence is one of the components that goes into establishing the actual wellhead protection area for the well and the actual area by which wells are being influenced. And that's used for things like when the state's looking at things like mitigation measures and so forth. Okay, maybe in this area we want you to keep an eye on this and so forth. Those are very important pieces of information that we get from the test. And all that gets summarized in a report, which Drew was mentioning was pretty much the final report, and that's the second time when you as the public are, get the opportunity to see, okay, here's what the test actually showed, and take a look at that along with the state. And that's it for me. Go ahead.
Have you asked people permission yet to test their wells?
We don't have an approved plan yet.
Okay.
Until we have an approved plan, yes.
So, just a general aquifer question. I'm not sure, but are they all connected? So, as water runs through the sand and gravel, does it run from one aquifer to another? And is this aquifer connected with others upstream?
So this aquifer system continues all the way. I showed you that one area. It actually continues up on the different valleys, that east-west valleys that come in. They're so far remote, though, at that point that they may be connected, but based on the mapping that the USGS has, they show those as being slightly isolated. It doesn't mean that they're not hydraulically connected, but the thing is, pumping at that rate, you're only going to form what's called a cone of depression, and that cone of depression only goes as far out as it has to capture enough of the aquifer to cause the water to move back towards the well. All right. When we look at those other areas further up, they're really more in terms of looking at recharge. That's kind of looking at it from the concern of what's going on up there, water quality-wise, or if somebody else were to put a well in, a large capacity. I'm not talking residential. I'm talking high-capacity wells.
So, but it's recharge. If the aquifer was to start losing water, those other areas of aquifers would drain down to the other.
Right. They would affect this aquifer. This aquifer wouldn't affect those sections of the aquifer because they're up gradient. Right.
So, if a Croydon resident wants their well to be part of the testing and it's not on the list.
Excuse me?
If a Croydon resident wants their well to be in the monitoring, preliminary monitoring, can they request that?
They can request it. I think, though, and again, it would be with the DES supports, if it's not in an area that's going to be anywhere in that aquifer, near that aquifer, say it's on the other side or by 89 or something, that's really not going to necessarily.
The rules require that the applicant offer to monitor all wells that are within 1,000 feet around the well, and then select wells that are a representative selection of private wells from within an area that's within 1,000 feet of the potential impact area that they've mapped. So certainly people can ask that their well be monitored if they're close or within the potential impact area, but just because of that, they might be in a location that doesn't make sense to monitor. There's limits to the monitoring network that will be established. And I mean, given the size of this withdrawal, which is modest, there's bigger withdrawals. We have permits for over 1,000 gallons a minute. This is a high yielding aquifer at a relatively modest amount. It seems like a big number, but it's not a huge withdrawal for this type of aquifer that can supply significant portions of water. So I guess what I want to emphasize here too is when you look at you have a large river there and the flow rate of the river compared to this withdrawal, this is a real drop in the bucket of the water that is available in this watershed, if that makes sense. And I know you haven't really touched on that, but what that means is that the potential impacts will be monitored on this, but it's unlikely that it goes far distances, kind of as his map shows. But that's what we'll be evaluating in this test is that potential impact and where it might go.
To Drew's point, somebody asked me about we were talking about recharge, and I said the water starts in recharge and it comes to discharge, and that's why the stream doesn't go. So when you look, what Drew's mentioned, you go down to that river and you look at how much water passes through that during dry periods, that's already telling you how much water. It's a fraction of the water in the aquifer, but it's a good comparison. And based on that 400 GPM as to what naturally comes through that stream, it's not a significant amount. Okay.
So based on that map, our well is on that map as a recharge. So how do you select out of the wells that are on that, who's going to be monitored? And from those people that are impacted by the recharge area, can they request to be monitored?
Where is your well?
It's on.
We're at the very end.
I had the booklet before. Flat Turnpike Road, I'm right here. And I understand I'm right here furthest away, but I'm impacted.
Well, you may not be impacted. It's a potential, okay?
Potential.
So, part of it has to do, too, with what other wells are between you and the pumping center.
Nice.
Okay? So, situation, if you're in between, you're not impacted, then you're not. Because it's like to get from point A to point C, you got to go through point B. If point B is an influence, then that would be it. So.
Am I correct what you said earlier, where this is going to be above the bedrock, so that our private well, if a drilled well goes below the bedrock, it's not likely to be affected by the cone of the aquifer?
Correct. So basically, the way these aquifers are, those bedrock systems, especially up on the valley sides, I believe the way the conceptual model is for this aquifer, besides recharge of precipitation that's infiltrating through, there's also this concept of runoff that goes off of those bedrock sides that actually goes underneath along the contact in certain areas. But on the ridges, where a lot of the bedrock wells are, okay, they're receiving recharge from up on the ridges. They're not receiving recharge from down there. But we do have a couple bedrock wells in the plan.
Yep, there will be bedrock well monitoring. From our experience in other settings like this, there are other settings where we have gravel wells in river valleys. It's very common. I think of Plymouth and North Conway. There's a host of sites like this. It's very difficult for a gravel well to impact a bedrock well just because it would have to pull the water the wrong direction. It's also very difficult for this gravel well to impact any water resource on the other side of the river because the river acts as a recharge point for the aquifer, and so it separates it likely will limit the potential impacts on anyone on the other side of the river.
I have an artesian well on the first house in Croydon in the flat. How was that going to impact?
I'm sorry.
An artesian well. So those are typically does it flow out the top of it, or is it a flowing well, or is it a drilled bedrock well? Yeah. So sometimes drilled bedrock wells are also called artesian wells. The word can mean different things, but It's like what I just said was I find it up at the northern part there, it's highly unlikely that a bedrock well up in that location will be impacted based on what we've seen on similar other settings. But that's the point of this test, is to assess for that.
So what happens to this?
Well, we have, like I mentioned earlier, any permit that is issued often has monitoring requirements, and those monitoring would be to do further assessment on any potential impacted resources.
I have other wells on my property that run dry, just because the neighbor pond.
Yeah, it's more likely that your well up there would be impacted by other closer wells, neighboring wells, because private wells can impact private wells, and just like, yeah.
So this public well is right next to a private or profit well. So now you're gonna have two sources out of this. All I did about this,
Private.
the Cary Street, there's a well.
Okay, that's further down,
Yep.
and that's sand and gravel.
Less than a quarter mile from where they're gonna tap in.
They will certainly be offered to monitor. We're aware of that. That is a public water system. It's a small community water system on a gravel well. So they're over 1,000 feet from the well, but they will be off. They're in the same aquifer, and they will most certainly be offered to monitor as part of this test. And we do have information on their well already, because they're regulated as a public water system.
So, okay, so now my real question. Right now, the town's going for 400 gallons a minute. If that's not enough, what happens if the town comes back and says we want to upgrade to 1,000 gallons? Does this whole process start over again?
Correct. Yep. So there's always a limit, a permitted limit, and if they wanted to retest above it, they would have to go through this process again.
So clear, the testing right now is in water, that's the cap.
Correct.
400 gallons a minute is what's proposed. And that, when they pump it, we can only approve to what they actually pump out. So if they end up only being able to pump 300, then they could only pump 300. If they ended up pumping, they could pump a little more. They would say they pumped. That's also, again, we'd be monitoring the impact at that pumping level for 7 days.
What I heard before was that there's groundwater and there's well water currently in Newport. There's one in the south, which is groundwater, that's feeding into the system, but the archaic or the old age, if you will, the pipes is questionable, possibly break, if you will, therefore not supplying the city or the town. So the groundwater becomes contaminated, and that pipe breaks. The only thing they have left is which is the backup, which is Plan B. So how much water do we take out of Plan B to cover the other two?
That's the point. This is an alternate placement. It's not an addition. So the whole point of that well, it's that 400 is intended to replace the other two.
Yes, you've been waiting. Thank you.
My question is for Mr. Kaufman.
Yeah.
And I got 100 questions, but I can boil it down to one. I could. We have a dump well that I've been monitoring for over a year, put all the database. And this summer during the drought, when all the trees were growing, we came within a foot of our well at Lake Drive. So this is why I'm concerned. So my question is, after all of this is said and done, if, for example, one of our wells goes dry because of this, are there any state regulations that help us out so our home doesn't become worthless? Yeah.
Right. Yes. So there are regulations regarding that would be if this withdrawal caused a well to dry, that would be considered an adverse impact. And we have requirements for mitigating adverse impacts. One way that it could be mitigated would be that they would
reduce or cease the withdrawal, obviously, if that returned your water. And then there are other cases where you could connect to a water system or something like that. That probably wouldn't be feasible in this case, or replace your source with a deeper well. So that we have had that's a very rare occasion, but it has happened, and we've worked with permittees and the affected user on very rare occasions. Right, that would be on the applicant's. Yes, the applicant would cover that. Typically there would be a monitoring to document the adverse impact. So we would need to show some sort of connection hydrologically between the pumping at the production well and your well. There's someone in the back.
I don't know if I have that intel or not, but is this because a proposed large community is being built in Newport?
From what I've heard, that this is not and Newport can speak to this better, but this is a source diversification is the primary driver of this. We do review their water use records, and they've been pretty steady over the years. There's maybe been a slight uptick in the past few years, but I don't know that there's a lot of planned growth in Newport.
No, I can tell you, I'm going to make up this number, 98% of our interest in this is water security, because we have all our water at the end of two very bad water mains. One main failure could leave the town high and dry in a matter of hours. So this is predominantly for the purpose of creating redundancy. It's not our intent to shut off the sources in the south side of town and switch over to this one. I presume we'll probably develop a plan over time as to how to manage these water sources. They'll be on, they'll be off, they'll bounce, they'll work under certain circumstances. But it pretty much is just a primary motivation. This is water security.
So let me add to that also, Jeff, that's what's slightly important. Some years back, we used to just use water and dump it, into the system. Lately, the past several years, they've been processing their water use has gone down quite a bit. So the amount of water that Newport is drawing, has basically gone down quite a bit, which, because less water is being run through the system, people are being billed less, our costs are the same, people are paying more for water. So it's not because we need the capacity for new growth, we have that already. It's primarily for the redundancy, for when we lose, for breaks or some reason, those pipes we have.
How will we know when testing begins? When you actually start, how will we know that? So I go out there, I now check the well every day. I can give you all that in the database if you want. But once you start pumping, I'm going to want to test it every couple of hours. How will we know when you start testing?
It won't be before spring.
Yeah, a lot has to happen before the pump test can happen.
Public notice that testing is about to begin?
No, there isn't necessarily a public notice. Once we approve the preliminary report, there's often additional communication to finalize the private well testing. So if you are in the monitoring, if you are a private well that is being monitored for the test, you will be made aware of when pumping occurs. But there is not any requirement to notify all of Newport or all of Croydon regarding this.
My phone number, would you call me?
I'm not going to make any promises, but we do have a sign-in sheet right over here.
I would do that. I'd make that commitment too. I'll give you a call.
Thank you.
No worries. Happy to do that.
Yep, so we do have a sign-in sheet over here. We can put your, yep.
You were saying switching it on as far as pumping and switching it off and such. Well, if it goes through and it is approved permitted, is there any plan to update the sources on the south side of town so that this isn't the only source for Newport's water, should anything adverse happen in the future?
The water main upgrades
Yes.
at the sources,
Yes, we currently have plans for, we recently, I'm going to use non-professional vernacular here. In the pond, there used to be what I call a straw. Think about this as, you're getting a soda or something with big plastic cups, You always try to stick the straw down in the bottom corner to get the last ounce of whatever you paid for. So the straw that was out in the middle of the pond, or not out in the middle of the pond, was not very far from shore. It was only 4 or 5 feet from the surface. So during the drought periods, the 5 foot worth of water above the intake dropped down to within a couple of feet, which is still a lot of water, but you just don't know how long these droughts are going to last or what the situation may be. And then there's the issue of quality. Do we all of a sudden have somebody go out there in a little motorboat and dump over 20 gallons of gasoline into the pond, and now we got to shut that off, right? But anyway, so that's my point. We took the straw and we pushed it further out into the pond and lowered it down by, how many feet? 20 feet. So now, comparatively speaking, don't hold me to this number, but we used to be 5 feet from the surface, now we're 25 feet from the surface. So if you look at a bowl, we're further out in the bowl and farther down. So there's a whole lot more water above that intake straw than there used to be. We've done that, that's already operational and working. So we have a lot more protection for a surface water source, and these guys can speak to this more than I can. It's still an unreliable source in the respect of its purity. It still can be easily contaminated. We've got more volume, but we're not protecting the quality of the water necessarily by sticking the straw, improving some of the volume. We also have the bond and a grant going right now that is $2.3 million worth of new water mains that are going to be, what's the distance from that? 4 or 5 miles? Yeah. So 4 or 5 miles from the source to the town. So we're going to be replacing $2+ million worth of water mains over the next 2 summers. The survey is right now. The work has already begun. But what we're going to do is we're going to take that $2 million and replace the pieces that the engineers have determined are like the most sketchy. The areas that are oldest, looking like they're having problems. So we're going to replace those, and we'll continue to do that. But to replace that kind of water main, I'll refer to these guys again. You're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're just going to keep plugging away, every few years to start catching the worst parts of it. So I forgot to ask that question, but it was not our intent at all to abandon those 2 sites. This is a backup for redundancy, and as I said, Frank can probably talk about this, but usually these plans result in a management plan where you cycle off. We do that right now. We use our pond sometimes, we use the well sometimes, and we cycle back and forth. And so on. I imagine this would fall in that same cycle.
You would never be running that pump 24 hours, 7 days a week.
I'm not going to tell you that, because there could be circumstances where if we had a major catastrophe on the mains in the south during a drought, we might have to look at this as a primary source. We don't run our pumps now at 24 hours, because we have storage tanks. We fill the tanks, we shut them off, because power is expensive. So we shut them off, and depending on the circumstances, the time of year, the demand, it's also one of those tanks are relying on, feet like that, we rely on those to provide the water. And we fill them up, and we drop it down. So I can't tell you that there's a whole lot of opportunity to run this location at full bore for, I don't know how long, a few days maybe or something. I don't
So do you know how to balance permit now, your 2 sources?
I believe the 400 replicates of what we use now. That's like the max. I mean, and that's why we're looking to say, okay, worst case scenario, and please, Frank, if I say something wrong, I won't just leave that, but, the reason why we came to the 400 was, okay, worst case scenario on the supplies on the south, if they just went offline just like that, and the tanks were at the bottom for some strange reason. We had a big fire conflagration, like Main Street. This has happened not necessarily in Newport, but I've seen it other places where you just have a fire in the street, you don't have the time to the other. Fire trucks come up, they dump water, they drain all the tanks, and we'll refill them as fast as we can. Not likely, but under those type of circumstances, that's when we would probably put the system to the test. But a massive failure on the south side of town could be replicated or replaced by this level of 400 gallons. That's basically what we're drawing now. But it's not in addition to, as Frank said, it's in the instance that we need to replace it for some period of time.
So how many years have you guys been pulling off again the bonds? I know you've been pulling off over 40, 50 years.
Anything far.
How many times has it let you down? How many times have you run out of water?
I'm gonna guess never. But we have, 6,500 people. We have some major industry that employ most of, some of you all. If all of a sudden they run out of water for some reason, or we have to shut off, since my time there, we've had to shut down Newport once for a failure. I don't know how long we want to tolerate that. If we lose a water main under pressure, replacing a water main under pressure is a big deal, and it takes a while of days. So we could easily see that water main shut down for a week.
Yeah.
And the town can drive for a week.
June, July, August, should have never. Many places you cross it, they would be checked.
All the more reason why I think this is important.
Yeah, well, you gotta be pulled with it.
I'm not sure, and you can address this.
You can't put a kayak down there, so.
Sorry?
You can't even put a kayak down there. So.
Yeah, I don't think we're pulling from the Sugar River. We're pulling from the basic under the whole region.
We'll see.
Okay, yeah, I think you.
So can one of you comment about, I don't know how to phrase this, the potential effects of climate change? We're all acknowledging the reality of more droughts. I perceive the droughts affecting surface water less than the aquifer, but how does the 7-day test, and at what time of year, acknowledge climate change or drought?
So we do the projections on yield, that add or correct or whatever. We know it takes certain safety factors. So whatever that pumping level is, we will then take that level and we'll extend it for another 6 months with no recharge, see where that water level is and where is that relative to itself. So there are certain things we touch upon relative to impact of drought. Likewise, even with respect to looking at the recharge to that river, trying to do projections based on things like stream flow stats and so forth. So those are some of the tools we can do. Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball. The one thing about that, though, that sort of kind of cuts both ways. There are also times where all of a sudden we get more rain than we expect, and then we get more recharge. So it's not just a drought. That seems to be what's most visible, but there's also the other end, and how does that affect our recharge and so forth. I think that's one of the things that's important about that recharge area up in the valley there, and the fact that if you look at that, there's not a lot of impervious surface. You don't have strip malls, you don't have industry, you don't have parking areas. So a lot of that rainfall is going into the aquifer. It's not being diverted. Those issues that kind of affect our work concern are when you get to heavily developed areas, like downtown, as an example, or you go to areas down by the seacoast where you have so much going on. So it's a little bit of a different scenario. I do want to say one other thing too. The southern well field, the southern well and the pond, it's the same aquifer system, because that's the south branch of the Sugar, that's the north branch, and they both go out to, they kind of combine over there, and then they continue. So that's the one nice thing also, is this well field is in a separate branch of that aquifer, but they do have similar characteristics.
And I'll point out too, and just with surface water and groundwater and drought and climate change, all these things are challenging topics that we do think about and consider. We do have regulations too about the well and its location to the floodplain of the river, and looking at impacts to any surface water features. So that is something we do look at. I can't get into specifics of what would be more or less impacted in this particular case, but in general, as a policy, we do like to have multiple redundant sources for municipal water systems like this, because they're more resilient in times of drought, and with the changing weather patterns that we've seen, this type of source will be a major asset to the water system in the long run. So I guess I'll say that, and I will also point out that just in terms of the flows in the river, that Newport does have a municipal sewer system, and their sewer system and their treatment facility for that it's just down actually at the bottom of the figure. It's below the well and influence area of the well, outside of the influence of the well, but the treated effluent does discharge back into the Sugar River. So when you think about it in terms of the Sugar River, you have withdrawals and discharges here.
It's not going out of the basin, it's staying in the basin.
What's your rough estimate for approval of plan and beginning of testing? How far down the road is that?
Right, so starting tonight with this, we'll have the hearing in a little bit once we wrap up some questions. We'll have a 45-day comment period, and that ends December 9th. And then after that, we will likely issue some type of comment letter back to the town or approval of the preliminary report. And there may be another back and forth. So I would, at the earliest, the pumping test could be in the spring, but they still have to drill the well and do a lot of other things. So this is again a long process. Yeah.
Yeah, if this impacts my well, and I can't use it, who takes another one? Who pays for it?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into we would obviously work with you and Newport to resolve it in the best manner fashion. So we would work, the specifics of exactly how that would work would get worked out with you, the person at the time.
So the statute related to these withdrawals, potential impacts from them, basically say that an adverse impact that occurs on a water user's well that impairs their ability to use it. Not all of them impacts impair people's abilities to use it. But when they do, and the mitigation, the approach to fix it is replace the well, then the well replacement will happen at no capital cost to the owner. So it's going to be associated with the applicant.
Just getting a well, and that maintenance will have to pay for the well then?
No, getting a well, like a replacement well on your property that you, similar to what you own now, you own it, it's yours. They would have to.
I have a problem, people that don't have property.
So again, I do want to point out, the likelihood of a bedrock well or a drilled well being influenced by a well like this in a river valley that has just a god-awful amount of water flowing through it is very unlikely. We just really don't see that in the environment. Not impossible, but not probable based on experience.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, back there and then there.
One of the things to affect the dog well, then an artesian, maybe something like that. Drain a dog.
Right, so a dug well would typically be in the same shallow sands and gravels that this well would be in. So if the dug well was close here, that would be potentially impacted. But like we said, that it's unlikely that this well will reach out that far due to the nature of the aquifer.
Okay. And then when you're doing your testing of 400 gallons a minute, right? Oh, right?
Yeah.
It is over 24 hours a day for 7 days, is that the testing period?
Yes, it's continuous.
Where is all that water getting dumped?
So the water is going to be discharged to the river. There will be monitoring points up gradient, down gradient, up gradient again, and down gradient, so that we can monitor what's additional and what's a loss.
Yeah, you don't want to have the water like such short cycling right back into the well, because that would overestimate the capacity of the well. So that's the idea, is you want to remove the water from the immediate area around the well. Yep. There shouldn't be we have rules about that whole process and a permit that's required for that, so that's part of the testing process.
Yeah, I mentioned the erosion control measures, and also if the well is made from silt, it's not going to be of use to anybody. So they got to that point, or that at the point of development, it's developed so the water was clear. There are certain standards it has to be. Can't even have sands of grains of sand in it. All that's taken care of. So the only thing in terms of that is erosion, and we take the proper measures.
I understand that. That discharge was about 400 gallons a minute. It's kind of awesome. Still, that river, that water comes out pipe.
Yeah, there's ways that you're right at the discharge point. There's a lot of force, and there's ways to dissipate that energy. It's not like there's a fire hose blasting into the river. So the discharge point itself, you use techniques. There can be things like plywood and tarps and hay bales and other erosion control features that are put around the silt fencing, that are put around the discharge point to dissipate that high energy, spread it out, and get it into the ground or the area where it's going to go. So that is something that can be challenging, but we have a good track record with that. Yeah, it was this gentleman.
Back to Newport storage facility, they have water storage facilities, correct? What is the capacity of that water storage facility? What is its average rate? What would the average rate to refill that at a quarter of a gallon per minute be?
So if the plant is a 300,000 gallon storage, okay, acts as a clear well for chlorine.
300,000?
Yeah, and then as you go down across town, like the main storage for the town is 1 million. So so you have you typically draw the tank down during the day, it cycles. So it's not, you don't run it empty and then run it full, you run it in a range. So it's a constant.
So the average, do you know the average water usage for the whole town?
Daily?
Daily.
Yeah, like 400,000.
And that would be less than 400 gallons a minute. So, yeah. Yeah.
If this testing permit was approved, would the town of Newport be willing to notify every resident in that potential impact area? Do we have a right to ask for that as part of your permit approval?
What do you mean by notify?
That we know when this testing is going to start. The town of Newport probably isn't required to, but if we ask for it in good faith, would the town notify everybody in that potential impact area?
Yeah, if I can get a list, I don't mind talking to you. I mean, as long as it doesn't interfere with your permitting process.
No. I mean, part of the process for the preliminary report is identifying potential impact, just what the water resources are and the water users within this potential impact area. So part of it is an inventory of, okay, where we have well records in our databases, but they're not comprehensive. So the applicant's required to investigate and say, okay, where is there a house that has a private well that's not connected to Newport's public water system, right? So any house that isn't connected likely has a well. So they will be required to collect some of that contact information and monitoring. Yeah. So I'm just saying this is part of it, and you will people in this area will likely get a letter asking for information about their well. Do you have a gravel well or do you have a bedrock well? Because that information is useful for us when we're trying to determine what wells should be included in the program. So that would be ahead of any pumping test. And then the exact timing of these, I guess I get a little weary because things can change and get bumped around. The schedules can always be a little tricky, but we certainly do want people to be notified. And I'll also point out that after any permit is issued, there's usually a notification of potential of water users within the impact area that was delineated in the final report.
Croydon and Newport have always been good neighbors, and we would do that just to be good neighbors, So aside from the permitting process, we can figure out how we get people's names and whatnot. But we put on our website, we call people who we've got on the list, and we're happy to do that. It only takes a few hours. We're more than happy to do that.
One thing I'll point out, there's an opportunity for, if and when we get to the final report stage, there's a second opportunity for a hearing. At that point in the final report, they're going to have refined the impact area on all the measurements that are being taken. And it's entirely possible that that potential impact area will shrink and not include Croydon if they determine that Croydon, all monitoring points to that no, the well only actually impacts that smaller circle area. So if that is the case, Croydon may not have an opportunity to have a final hearing, but Newport would. So at that point, Croydon we wouldn't have a hearing here. I'm just saying this is hypothetical. I'm not sure what we're going to find out. But that, based on this, it's entirely possible that the impact area is limited to an area within 1,000 or 2,000 feet surrounding the well. And just for a sense, that's like, I think it's over a mile from the well up to Croydon Flat. So it may significantly shrink once they actually do the test. So I just point that out as a piece of information.
What's the estimated cost to do this?
The estimated cost?
3.5.
3.5 million. How many residents in Croydon? How many households in Croydon? So if you send a letter out to 750 households, at $2 a letter, it's $1,500 against a $3.5 million road. Why can't you send a letter out?
He didn't say it.
He
didn't say it.
I just sit there saying it's a drop in the bucket of $3.5 million and make people comfortable. They know when you're going to do the testing.
Yeah, I think it sounds like Newport's willing to work, and we're willing to work to notify people as appropriate. Okay, any other questions?
It looks like you have 3 zones around the well.
Right.
For the people that have property in those zones, is it going to cause any land use restrictions?
No.
So one side have
Other than
that's in there?
They what?
The junkyard.
The junkyard. Well, junkyards do have permitting requirements, so there are rules regarding junkyards, and you would be obligated to follow those. Other than the water system has to control and own what's called the sanitary protective radius, which would be in this case a 400-foot radius around the well. Beyond that, they're not obligated to own or control land use outside of that. There is something called a wellhead protection area and program, but that is more of an educational mailing, and they can do what's called a best management practice surveys for best management practices at potential contaminant sources, but there's no legal sort of obligations or restrictions on anybody in that zone.
And exactly, how big is this aquifer compared to others in Woodland?
I would call it medium. There's certainly bigger ones, like in the Merrimack and the Ossipee area. Connecticut River, but it is a decent sized aquifer here. There's certainly smaller ones. Newport is in an excellent position here, relative to some other towns that are really struggling with the amount of water and the quality of water right now. There's lots of towns, particularly in southern New Hampshire, that would love to have an opportunity like this to develop a source and just don't have that. So this area is really lucky to have this water resource potentially available to them at this time. Okay, I'd like to wrap up.
If Croydon were to develop quickly, and we were to put a similar well, a similar size, Croydon Drive, we would have reciprocal with Newport, because we would be in your feed zone. But we would be fine to the nail of what we're in.
You could follow this process. Yeah, you could follow this process, yep. That doesn't preclude you from any other water user in the aquifer. Okay, this has been excellent, good questions. Thank you, everybody. Just for everyone's sake, I know it's getting late, and I think it's time we move on to the next portion of this process. I think we can turn this off.
Well, wait until we open the hearing.
So, while I have everyone's attention, what we're going to do, we're going to take a break in a minute, but before we do, here's what's going to happen in the hearing portion. This is the opportunity for anyone to submit a public comment. You will come up to the microphone and submit your comment, and we will be recording it. Now, before you do, we're going to take a little bit of a break before we start this process, and I'm going to ask that if you want to come up and submit a comment for the record, that you come up here and you grab one of these yellow cards, and on it write your name, your address, and your affiliation. And that's just for the record that this is an official public hearing. We are not going to respond to any of these comments. At this time, we will note them, and I'll note that they have to be relevant to this project that we've discussed, not the surface water or other related issues, but regarding this withdrawal in Newport. And if you think of something later, you can always submit a written comment to us. And we have our cards up here and contact information and a sign-in sheet over there if you'd like, if that's helpful for you. So we can give you, we have some cards and contacts up here, and you could submit it in writing to us or even to Newport, and we would coordinate with them. But please submit it to us directly. That comment period will be open to December 9th. So we'll take a 2-minute break or 3-minute break. So come on up if you're interested and write your name down, and then we'll call you up in a few minutes.
This is not intended to be a give and take, right?
No, it's not. We're just going to take. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Good debate, good discourse there. Good
I would love, yes. No, it would be professional. It would be very good. clear up.
Yeah. Look at all this spaghetti corn. I had it figured out that wraps around itself just enough to be complicated. There we go. Oh yeah, you can drop that. Well, other than a laser pointer, I think we did pretty good. Okay. Maybe we can.
I bet some on the counter or there's a bench.
John Anderson. Andrew Cobb, thank you for your question. Yeah. Yeah, and you survived the drought this summer. Yeah.
I hauled water for the toilets, we took showers outside of the rain,
Yeah.
but we survived.
Yeah.
So of course, that's why I'm interested.
Yeah.
But if everything I've had in my day,
Yeah, I am. We're interested in data sources like that.
I take a tape measure of it down and
Yeah, that's great.
and I do it during the drought season. I do it every day.
Yeah. Do you see it like half an inch at a time?
That's the reed started.
Yeah.
See this mic on that stand?
So I'm not only checking it once a week.
Yeah. Well, good. I hope you can use some more water.
I hope so.
Do you know what we have? There's actually a program right now where there's money available to get a replacement well if your well's affected by drought. You might be at, I don't know, there's income levels that, but we what?
Right. I live on Social Security.
Yeah.
I'm a disabled good, I'm veteran. I get a very nice VA pension.
Okay.
If you count that,
I don't know, there's numbers, so we could talk to you about it, and there's other, yeah.
Is this the man to talk to about that?
Well, he has been involved himself, but
The current, go ahead.
That's why we see what the...
Yeah.
I'm not a doomsday guy.
Yeah.
I'm just a practical guy.
No, and I strongly, just to be honest with you, I don't think this well is going to be able to make it. There's really no way for it to get up to Croydon up in the northern part. So the drought is a much bigger driver than
groundwater.
Yeah.
We're not down to that.
Yeah, you're in shallow groundwater.
Right. And then the areas with the rain and everything.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Okay, we'll call the hearing to order.
Sign up.
We have, can I have everyone's attention? Thank you. All right, so we're going to start the hearing. The time, official time is 8:46. Right now, we have one person. Is there anyone else who didn't write their name down who's interested? All right, I will call up our first person, Joe Marco, who's the select man from Croydon. Welcome. If you want to come up to this mic right here, Joe.
You need to officially open the hearing.
I did.
Well, you're kind of making it easy because I'm going to steal a little bit from what
you all said tonight. Potential, possible, projected, those words were used a lot. He said how important water is to people and to life. Okay, I represent a bunch of people that live along that river, and there's more than one or two that have either gravity wells or dug wells. They're well within this area, and I have other people that understand that gravity works and water flows downhill. So there's more people along the river and in other areas that are worried too. I heard the guarantee about being able to replace the wells and stuff. However, we did stumble at one point on how someone would accept that. It's a matter that the well has to be monitored. The town of Croydon, like every resident along the river for a positive impact, to be guaranteed that their well will be done. If they need monitored, whatever. But there needs to be a guarantee. There's too much potential, there's too much protection, there's too much possibility. These people cannot risk waking up in the morning, turning their faucet on, and having it tapped down. Not for one day. Even if the impact comes back 3 days later, you know. Any guarantees, this possible, if it has to be monitored, the people need to be told, there can't be any, oh, well, I'm sorry, you didn't fill out this paper, so they're screwed. There can't be. There has to be something these people can be assured that if something happened, and I mean every one of them in this town, in the area, because these people have worked their lives to get these houses, and they deserve to have water, not to have somebody take it. I understand everything Newport's going through, okay? I do, but why tap the bottom of the funnel back with her right there? They're in the bottom, tapping that. Okay, everybody else up through is affected. And the other thing I'd like to bring up is that test in the spring, when you're doing snow melt, that kind of is a little bit of a side test there. So I would also like that if the test does go through to shoot more like September, really get a more accurate reading on what water's in the aquifer. Just bring that level right to the top, and it's going to have a real nice test. And then 6 months later, we're going to be screwed. So there needs to be guarantees to the people.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Okay, seeing none, I will move to close the hearing. And the time is 8:49 or 8:50 now. With that said, the comment period for this report will remain open until December 9th. If you have any other written comments that would be like to be submitted into for our consideration in the review of this report. That said, did I miss anything? Missing anything? I don't think we did.
How would those written comments be submitted? Can they be emailed or?
Yes, they can be emailed or mailed to us. I have a card here with my email if anyone wants to do that. And also, it's available on our website, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. All right, that said, thank you all for your time and thoughtful questions and comments. Have a good night.
Anybody has any additional questions?
Yeah, we can hang around if anyone wants to talk more. Thank you. Oh, yeah. All right, you got it?
I'll take it off. Don't hold everything. Nobody could hear more.
I'm not sure there. There's actually